Next up is Piet Roux from Sakeliga. As a medical software provider to private practices, NHI is a big deal to GoodX. Have the ability, really, or the inclination as a company to sell to big people. We don't sell to people like Mediclinic, the big corporates, and even less to government. So it is in our interest, and I think in our country's interest, to have healthy, innovating practices. We love innovation. We love enabling our clients to innovate. And we would love them to come talk a bit about the NHI and what parts of that do not comply with the constitutional law and system we have. And from our perspective, I don't care about the rest of it, whether it's going to be, how this will play out in terms of corruption and things like that. What I care about is that my practitioners, the people who use our software, remain free to innovate, remain free to run their businesses. And from that perspective, we've involved Sakeliga, and I'm going to hand over to Piet to talk a bit.
Thank you, Cobus. Ladies and gentlemen, Cobus approached us a while back to discuss the NHI. The NHI has been long in the works, but it's now at that point where something needs to be done. And I sat in some of the presentations this morning, and I just thought by myself, I'm looking at the screen, I'm looking at people dedicated to building software for users, for businesses, and I just try to imagine the government designing that software, or the government running that software, or the state figuring out what a good legacy code management system looks like, etc., etc. And I just imagine all the ransomware and everything. So I'm very pleased to have been invited by Cobus to speak here about our views on the NHI, what we think can be done, what we're already doing, and why it's crucial that we just say no. And when I say we say no, I mean, I'll explain that why, but I want to emphasize that the NHI is not a foregone conclusion. It depends on what we do and what companies like GoodX and private practices are doing. Up on the screen behind me is a very nice picture. It says happiness. And it also says, behind this gentleman, we're all in it together. And it also says it's issued by the Central Government Publications Board. This is a scene that looks ominous, but it says happiness. It's a scene from the movie Brazil by Terry Gilliam in 1985. And it's a movie where something goes wrong. And what happens is that in this huge world of happiness, where government controls all medical services, all information, all food provision and everything, there's one little flaw that happens. And somewhere when somebody is supposed to type in Mr. Tuttle should be arrested, a fly goes sits on the typewriter and it ends up being Mr. Buttle. And this whole movie is about this world where government controls everything, where it says happiness on the front page, but in the works, people eventually die because of spelling errors, because of system errors, because a system does not care about the best interests of patients, about the human behind the digits on the screen or the ink on the typewriter. And so it is sometimes said that the NHI has a noble goal. I say that the NHI has a noble excuse. Unfortunately, the goal, if we read the Act, if we listen to the statements by the ministers, the idea is for government to control medical provision, health care provision in the country. That is not a noble goal. That is a very foolish goal. Unfortunately, no matter what the excuse is, the realities matter. And so this talk today will not be about a point-by-point analysis on the legal aspects. You will hear a lot of that. You can speak to us if you want to talk like that. This talk will feature on the essence of what the NHI is proposed to do, what it really means behind all the headlines, so it's sold under, and it's also not about the intentions or the good excuses that are used. It's about what it will actually mean. What is the NHI? The NHI is an attempt to take over the private sector to compensate for the state's failure in providing public health care. It's an attempt to take over what you've provided, what you are providing, to compensate for the failure of what is currently being provided by the state. It even necessitates a change in the Competition Act, because the Competition Act says there can't be monopolies or monopsonies, people who only one single buyer of services. The Competition Act will even have to be changed for this to be put in place. It is to make government a monopoly provider and procurer of medical services. Now, some people will say, and this is of course how it's being sold, it says, well, ladies and gentlemen, we will make the public sector, we will elevate the level of medical services all across the country to the level of private care medical services, as if costs don't matter, but the inverse way. We will not turn the public sector into the private sector, we will be turning the private sector into the public sector. It is completely inverse that will actually happen. One thing that is often missed is that South Africa already has universal basic health care. It's not perfect, it's not extensive, it doesn't cover everything, there are often waiting times, but in general at the point of care, a basic health care service is being provided for free in South Africa. Now the quality of that has deteriorated. I've recently seen movies of, I think it was a Durban hospital with monkeys running across the rails, and we've all seen some of the clips, and you in the medical world know what it looks like in the public, in the state hospitals, in many of them, but that already is in place. And the reason why we're seeing this pressure on the private sector now is not because there isn't something, it's because government has already proven itself failing to provide, even at the basic level, to administer the complexities required. Also, another reason why it's not useful today to try and go into an exact explanation of how the NHI works is because it's too complex. That act is about 30-40 pages, and then there's a schedule of all of the acts that has to be changed, and then there will be reams and reams and reams of regulations still to be published over many years now, because the act itself does not completely spell out exactly what will happen. It's not clear what it will cost, it's not clear what the systems will look like, it's not clear what you will be allowed or not be allowed to do. We only know that there will be a death sentence over all private provision, virtually all private provision of medical care, because as soon as the state decides to systematically make that part of the National Health Insurance Fund, then that will be, how shall we say, retired. So only Mr. Nicholas Quist and some of the bureaucrats perhaps might know, but maybe they don't even know, and they'll make it up as they go. And that's what will happen over the next 10 to 20 years as there's an attempt to implement the NHI. Our position is it will never be implemented. As far as it is attempted, it will be made up on the fly, exactly what it will entail. And that's not a good way for running a country, that's not a good way for managing society, and not something as critical as healthcare. Ladies and gentlemen, it's also not insurance. Despite what is called the National Health Insurance and National Health Insurance Fund, it's not insurance. It is a single procurement and single management system for healthcare provision. Insurance is something of a pool of money collectively paid in with a risk profile that is paid out on certain conditions. This is not about health insurance, this is about the centralization of healthcare services and adding a tax on, everybody in the country who supposedly can pay, and with subsidies for those who can't pay, but everything into a single fund. It's basically a tax, it's not an insurance scheme, it's a tax scheme to fund a healthcare system. So, unfortunately, we must again, always, has anybody ever heard of an act where it says the Destruction of Private Healthcare Act, or the Abolishment of Cheap Meat Act, or something like that? No government, no politician ever calls an act by what it might do, or what it will do in this case. As in good public communications, they also have their public communications consultants, and they pick a name that makes it sound nice. So always, with any government law, you have to read beyond the words of the act. In essence, over time, the act will take away your ability as businesses to freely contract. Free contracting is the essence of innovation. It's the essence of what makes it possible to be agile, to respond to needs, to come up with new machines, new techniques. It's your ability to contract so that you know there will be an income stream to pay for that. And then the Act aims to establish a super medical fund, not an insurance fund, just a fund. And it then says that there will be place for medical aids where there is supplementary cover, where something under the government scheme is not funded and provided for. And then over time, the government scheme will provide for more and more, and the private medical services will be prohibited from doing any of that and will be limited to doing less and less. It's a very strange thing. We are being sold an act. The NHI Act is something that will improve the lives of everybody, make the country a better place. But it's so good that you actually have to prevent people from providing an alternative. That's always a bad sign. When something's so good that you're not allowed to provide an alternative. It's like if you come up George Torre Road here in Pretoria, you see the South African Bureau of Standards, and their big advertisement says, "We are the only provider of standards in South Africa." It always makes me wonder if what they can output can really be of much considered. The cost estimates of this NHI fund ranges from R250 million to R1 trillion a year. It's massive. There's no proper modeling behind this. So my conclusion just about what the NHI is, that it effectively eliminates the ability of private actors to independently contract for healthcare services. It's the nationalization of healthcare, and you'll be a cog in that wheel. Your business will be a cog in that wheel. There's some consequences to developing something like this. The first is that you break things. The first thing that will be broken is private healthcare, the private healthcare sector. There'll be no innovation, no investment. I'm not saying none. I'm not saying overnight, tomorrow you won't be investing. GoodX is investing, this conference is an investment. You're investing in your practices. And so far as the NHI is implemented, insofar as we allow it to be implemented, insofar as we offer our cooperation, insofar as we help it along, every step of the way, there will be less room for innovation, less room for investment, because we are helping it to its ultimate goal, which is to abolish the need for private healthcare. Of course, the need will never be abolished, the need will be increased, but the provision will be outlawed. So the first thing is that you will break the private sector. Then you won't be doing business. Your business, not only if you're a doctor, if you have a practice, in the end, you will become part of a system instead of becoming part of a business. And even if you want to do philanthropy, I've never come across a medical practice that doesn't do some kind of philanthropy, some kind of charity, some kind of free service, show some kind of humanity. That's part of the Hippocratic Oath, that's part of the long tradition of medical practice, where you also provide an element of care without accepting remuneration, or at least we even make a loss. That's always been part of a healthy system, and it's integral to what being a medical professional means. But under the NHI, even that will be regulated, even your ability to provide care and services out of your own good heart. Then the second thing it will break is the direct relationship between doctor and the healthcare provider, the doctor or the healthcare provider and the patient, the doctor-patient relationship. That'll be infringed upon seriously, because your best medical judgment and the best interest of the patient won't be the deciding factor anymore. The system's prescriptions and controls will be. The waiting, the queues will be, you won't have a discretion in getting somebody to jump a queue. The government system will provide or determine what the queue looks like. When I travel, my wife is Dutch, and we've been to once she got an eye infection there in Holland, and people think that Europe's healthcare system is so great, but I hear very bad things from the NHS in England and so on about waiting times. But I can even speak of personal experience that something that would have seriously damaged her eyesight, she could only get a quick appointment like the next day in South Africa. Over there she would have had to wait a month. And that's what queues do. And that's what national healthcare systems do. They get you into a queue. They get you into a queue if you're the provider. They get you into a queue if you're the person in need. And they also get you in the queue even if you're not a person of need, but just it's very hard for a system to distinguish between a hypochondriac and a real patient with a degree of severity. Something that you're all accustomed to will now become part of a bureaucratic system. Then finally, it will be the foundation for ever-creeping government control. And we're just looking around us, from small towns to ESCOM to water management. It's not a great idea to get the government in control of more things when the existing complexity cannot be managed already. Now, when you break things like this, you don't only harm the businesses, you don't only cause stress for public servants, you not only harm patients, you actually cause social changes, you cause social catastrophes, and you cause fiscal crises. The fiscal crisis that hides in this NHI is something substantial. I think the government budget annually now is something like 2 trillion. This will be another quarter of a trillion to another trillion annually. We're speaking about a substantial increase in the tax rate in South Africa or the debt levels in South Africa to fund this. And it's not fundable. You know, you can only eat an apple once. So any money you spend on this new venture will come at the cost of money you're spending elsewhere, either in the private sector, in your own hands, or even the money the government has available. So we're definitely heading for a fiscal crisis with the NHI to the extent that the NHI gets rolled out. The tax base in South Africa to fund it does not exist. Then there's a social crisis also that comes from it. The social crisis comes at least from 3 corners. The first is that there is an expectation of free, unlimited healthcare. And no country in the world has free, unlimited healthcare. But once politicians start speaking about we need to provide free healthcare, once public expectations get raised, it will increase the demand for additional healthcare, and that will necessarily, as in everywhere in the world, because the whole world is always limited by some resource constraint, that expectation will somehow have to meet reality. That is when you get unrest. That is when you get demonstrations before hospitals. That is when you get disruptions in queues. That is when you get social unrest. So when you raise the expectations of free, unlimited care above the level of what society can provide. So severe social unrest due to unrealistic expectations will come. Then there will be an exit of middle class and golden geese, you could call them in South Africa. People of a high income level require and attach a lot of value to good quality medical care. And if you destroy the medical system in South Africa, which is a great benefit, it's better here than in many instances, in many places even in Europe. If you destroy that, you take away some of the additional reasons to live in South Africa, to put up with a lot of other problems, to make it work here. You add an additional reason for people to leave. With additional, again, pressure on the tax base, but not only on the tax base, on the fabric of society. And then, let's say that's enough for that. So that's, I've now said something about the consequences to the NHI. But let's take a step back and say, well, what caused this? What's behind the drive for the NHI? There's the failure of the public healthcare system, and then there is ideology. And it's not always easy to distinguish this, because sometimes people are driven by a real need, a real feeling, a real willingness, a real conviction to help other people. But it's very hard to distinguish whether that's the real underlying motivation, or whether somebody actually does something for ideology. Because they believe in some kind of equality, because they believe in some kind of abstract ideal, because they believe they dislike the fact, because they want to make society look exactly like they want it. And I'm afraid that what I see from gentlemen like Mr. Nicholas Quist, what I see from many of the politicians who propose the NHI, is that I see more of an ideology, an ideological drive, than a good care drive. So that's part of it. So ideology is, I think, a lot of what sits behind this. But then also there's the real problem of a failed public healthcare system. But there is also a problem of a not innovative enough, not highly invested enough, maybe not a flexible enough private sector. The private sector could probably do better at private provision of medical care services. And ironically, again here, we already have severe constraints by government on making the private sector work. So over the last 20 years, a lot of limits have been placed on the ability, your ability to innovate, medical aid's abilities to innovate. There's actually part of the problem is the existing animosity toward private provision of the last at least 20 years. So let me give you a few of those by Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, who's with the IRR, and she's done a good analysis of this. Currently, there's a 25% reserve requirement for medical schemes. This is arguably too high and makes the premiums need to be too high for medical schemes. Secondly, young and healthy people are discouraged from joining medical schemes because of the prescribed fees and the fee structure of the medical schemes. You actually discourage young and healthy people from coming in at a lower price point and making these funds more sustainable. You're also forcing medical aids to provide these 300 and more prescribed medical benefits, which drive up the cost of entry-level medical schemes, which would bring more people into the private sector medical net. You also, over the last few years, the tax benefits have significantly been reduced for your private medical aid on your income tax. And there's a pledge to eliminate this. There's a pledge even to eliminate tax deductions for private medical aid. Then government is downplaying and decreasing and has pledged to eliminate the medical aid for state employees because they want them all into the national fund system. And then they have barred low-cost medical schemes, which was supposed to be implemented in 2016 already. 8 years ago, there was supposed to be low-cost medical schemes bringing people into the private sector. That has been disallowed. Again, I come back to this point of if the government's idea is so great, why don't we allow other people just to try and be better? No, it was outlawed to make low-cost medical schemes affordable, which would have brought up to 15 million people above the additional 9 million currently into the medical schemes net and made the private sector more accessible to them. And I'm talking about something like 200 rand a month adult per member fee. That's really low. That's some of the estimates that some of the companies think they can afford, or they can offer as an entry price point. But that's been outlawed. Okay, how do we stop it? Well, there are some weak points in this National Health Insurance Fund, and I think it can be stopped, and I think it must be stopped. It's one of those things we have to say no to. Here are some of the weak points. The first is that it is exceedingly complex. It's so complex that the Act doesn't even explain how it works. Mr. Crisp and others will have to make it up as they go. There's bound to be contradictions, there's bound to be legal attacks on all of it. Every step of the way, the NHI is exceedingly complex. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about an incredibly complex system, about 60 million people being provided medical care for through a central system with central databases, central procurement. That is incredibly complex. Then also it's unaffordable, we've talked about that. It's also impractical, it ties in with the complexity and unaffordableness. Then there's the element of time. This is another weak point. The NHI is supposed to be implemented in phases over time. It's spelled out, it's not clear what the timeline looks like. It also has to be made up on the go. But we all know, and even the proponents of the NHI agree, that this will take a long time. A long time is a good thing, because it gives you, as medical businesses, the opportunity to innovate around its constraints. It offers you and the civil society and others the opportunity to develop and just keep repeating court cases. It gives the opportunity for the public to see how, whatever failure the phases is, so it gives more time to discredit it. So time is a weak point for the system, and a very good thing for us who would like to stop it. Then also another weak point is that it relies on your cooperation. So it relies for its success on your cooperation. And to the extent that you delay your cooperation, to the extent that you ask for an explanation, to the extent that you keep focusing on being a good healthcare provider instead of being a good complier, you will delay the implementation of the rollout of the NHI. So again, there's a weak point that it relies on people who know it's not a good idea to get it done. And then finally, it's also unlawful and unconstitutional. There are very good grounds to suspect several successes against the NHI over the next coming years. One or two lines of attack. We think that there are three important ones. One is the public line of attack, publicly discrediting it, showing that government itself sits behind some of the problems, explaining that making government in charge of all healthcare will not make all healthcare look like the private sector, it will make the private sector look like all healthcare currently provided by government. So publicly discrediting the NHI, the public relations approach is a very good approach, because in the end it's very hard for a government, for a state to move against substantial and an overwhelming public opinion. So that's important. The second one is what we call the man-up approach, or the maximum achievable non-compliance approach. It's a phrase we frequently use at SAKALIGA, because not everything can be solved by public relations, not everything can be solved by litigation. Sometimes the maximum achievable non-compliance approach is also very good. And we've chosen those two words carefully. We're not, because we understand how businesses work at SAKALIGA. You can't just ignore laws. You can't just ignore licenses. You can't just ignore the consequences, because some decisions, if you decide not to do something or not comply with something, you will make people lose their job. You will have to close down, or even face fines and jail time under some circumstances. So, to the extent that it is possible, to the extent that it is feasible, we recommend maximum achievable non-compliance. Delaying your support for something, delaying your cooperation, not pre-complying, but being at the tail end of compliance, only to the extent that you are forced to, is a very good thing. And to the extent that any business in South Africa does a maximum achievable non-compliance, it will free them up to do more innovation, it will free them up to do more investment, it will free them up to focus on their patient relationships instead of focusing on complying with government. But of course, that is part of the solution. And then finally there is the legal approach. And I will briefly spend another 5 minutes on the legal side, what we think can be done there, and then we can have some question time, if you like. So, ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned time, and I mentioned the unlawfulness and the unconstitutionalness of this. There is very good reason to expect substantial court cases. In fact, some of them already been launched. There's very good reason to invest in court cases because they will delay the implementation and potentially even be enough to completely stop it, together with some of the other things I've mentioned. Let me give you an idea of where those opportunities lie. Well, there's an opportunity right now. The Act has been promulgated and 2 court cases have already been launched, even before regulations have been put in place. So there's an opportunity right now. Then there's before implementation. Then there's an opportunity for court cases after implementation, depending on the kind of implementation. Then there's an opportunity for litigation when the regulations get promulgated, about the process of promulgation, about the content of the regulations. Then there is an opportunity for litigation every time the regulations get implemented, administrative law approaches. So for the next several years, there are litigation opportunities ranging from the most basic constitutional lines of attack to right through to administrative law, rationality, each case of implementation. There is a lot of ways to keep government busy in court. Then some of these cases have already been launched. The South African Health Funders Association has launched one, Solidarity has launched one. Both are different. The one attacks, the Health Funders one takes a procedural approach. Solidarity's one takes a more social impact and rights of the patient approach. Both are good. Then several others have threatened litigation, political parties, medical aids, medical industry associations, and it's very good, the more litigation the better. At SAKALIGA, we think there must be another kind of litigation that we haven't seen come through there, and we're preparing to add that to the basket. Not as an optional extra, we think it's essential. And that is that we think there has to be a court case from the perspective of business owners, from the perspective of people who need to innovate, from the perspective of people who need to invest, who have made investments, and who have set up healthcare establishment for the long run. We think that the businesses also need to have a court case. We've done great work there already. We will address the distinct need of healthcare businesses. It will be about your right to contract, your freedom to be a business person. It will be about the states making its responsibilities your responsibilities. The state is making its responsibilities your responsibilities. We can't allow that. It will also be about rationality, the balance of rights, and then we think that your right to a profession also needs to be a doctor's profession, nurse's profession. As a profession, it needs to be protected, but we don't think it'll be enough on its own. Our advocacy has been briefed. We've developed draft notice of motion, and we've contracted with expert witnesses. And the phase we're in now, which is what we're happy to partner with GoodX, is building the data, building the evidence that we will need to present to court. We want to take an evidence-based approach to court. And for that, in the next few weeks, you might be approached to fill in a questionnaire. And if you could do that, we would really appreciate that, because we will give that data, we will anonymize it, we won't use your name, we will give that to an expert witness, they will analyze it. They're a company that looks at these market effects. We will use that data and those experts to build the case that we think is necessary to take a non-emotional case to court. A case about what the effects really will be if we infringe on the rights of business to be a business. One more point before I close. In recent weeks there has been some proposals for a middle ground. Some proposals that say, well, maybe we can make some concessions and then they'll be cheaper, and maybe we can avert the fiscal crisis and some of the problems. And that proposal has come in the form of saying that there must be compulsory medical aid for every employed person in South Africa. Now, if we just say that quickly, compulsory medical aid for all employed people in South Africa, that actually sounds good. We know what it means to have medical aid or not medical aid. Gives you better care, makes it more affordable, there'll be economies of scale and so on. But this is one of those cases where we have to think a few steps ahead. We have to understand that once we do this, we will have a higher tax rate in the country. Yes, it will be maybe half as expensive as the current proposal, but it will still be unaffordable. We have to understand that we are not taking a sustainable approach to getting a country more productive, healthcare system more productive. We're following the route of a more indirect tax, government subsidy kind of approach, which has already proven itself not viable. We also ignore the preferences of people sometimes who maybe prefer, I know it's a risk to not have medical aid, but some people are in dire straits and prefer to use that money for food, or prefer to use that money for other emergencies. So there are important religious and personal preference considerations we are ignoring here. And then of course this is also another problem, is that if we do this, we will make medical schemes enormously concentrated in power. We will enormously increase the power of medical schemes relative to you as businesses. And medical schemes are a wonderful thing, but there's a risk when medical schemes become too big, too concentrated, and too involved with government. You will see price prescriptions to you, you will see systemic prescriptions to you. And so as much as it sounds great to have compulsory medical aid, we must realize that we will be concentrating an enormous amount of power backed by the power of the state, but also by the influence of the state in a very small group of large medical schemes. And the risk is that we will see a kind of indirect NHI through the influence government is able to have through its licensing and its relationship with a few big medical schemes implemented. It won't be the NHI that's currently being proposed, but it will still be an NHI that is very harmful to the interests of everybody in this country. Let me conclude. At this stage, it's not that important to have a very detailed and specific understanding of the NHI. It is sufficient and it is important to understand that there's a question to be answered. And only one of them, well, you can answer. The first question is, do you want to be a cog in the wheel of the government system? Or do you want to be a free business providing healthcare in a provider-patient relationship that is under your control? The one road, former, is the road of the NHI. The second is the one that we must take and that we can take if we do maximum achievable non-compliance, if we do the right public relations, we explain why this is a problem, and we build public opinion against the NHI, and if we do successful and incessant litigation of the next few years. Do we want to be Mr. very happy, or yeah, the question basically is are we going to need Mr. Buttle or Mr. Tuttle? And I propose that you are much better to be trusted with providing medical care. Thank you. Cobus, would you like me to take questions or?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
So, having personally lived in England for more than 2 years, I could not once see a doctor. I was under the NHI, paid my fees. I could not once get to a doctor. It was not a pleasant experience.